Okay. Well, thank you, Michelle. It's very nice to be able to talk about a subject that I've spent a lot of time on, and I know I'm still learning things about it, so I can start out the whole presentation by saying I do not know everything, and y'all may know things that are just common sense that I'm just barely picking up on. So I think the fact that there will be questions at the end is a wonderful aspect to help kind of bring together what I know and what y'all maybe want to know. Um, but in terms of just starting out with things, I think we'll do a short introduction and then try to tell you some of the base level information about loneliness and maybe something to give you perspective, because sometimes it's about who's experiencing this. Am I part of that? And does that make me feel any better being a part of a crowd, ironically, for loneliness as a topic? So, things to start out with. Obviously, my name's Kevin Smith. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist that works in the community. I know this presentation is kind of put together by the University of Iowa, and I'm affiliated with that through the Couple and Family Therapy Doctoral program. So, hopefully, I will be a PhD in the near future. I know I'm a big old fancy pants, but I do appreciate Iowa for giving me all this training and time, but I also work in the community at a private practice for mental health called Covenant Family Solutions. We have an office in Coralville, which is a satellite one. I'm actually in that office right now, where I see clients on a regular weekly basis. Also have colleagues that do that. And then we have other offices in Cedar Falls and downtown Marion, as well as in northern Cedar Rapids. So I do try to practice what I preach, and I do try to put these things into motion when I can. But the only other thing I will probably clarify, because it's going to slip out of my mouth more than one time, and it already has, I caught it. I use the phrase y'all because I grew up in Texas, and I'm a native Texan until I was 24. So I have a little bit of drawl or slang that slips out of me, and I'll try to make it general and useful to everyone so it's not going to confuse anybody. Also, if I use a word you don't know, it is best to just ask the question. So, with all that said, let's jump in and see what we can get going. There we go. So, when looking at loneliness, I like to start with a very basic perspective and a very straightforward approach that we know the word, we get confused about what's involved with it, and we can kind of mince things, and we have a hard time letting other people know what we're going through because either A, it's not a very positive thing to share. It can be a somewhat shameful. If you tell someone I'm very lonely, they could assume that you're really needy or that something's wrong and somehow you need extra help. But in reality, everyone is going to feel a bit of this. And so a great way to look at it and just say, what am I talking about if I'm lonely, is phrased as it's the discrepancy or the difference between a person's desired social relationships and their actual relationships. It can also be the difference between the preferred amount of relationships or type and then what we perceive as having relationships. And so that can kind of come out to mean a couple of different things. I have one example on the screen that says this means you can have good relationships or even just have available ones while still feeling like they aren't enough or different from what you were hoping for. So you can kind of see how the name or the description comes about. But I think in a big way, loneliness is definitely a mismatch between what we imagine is happening and what actually is happening. So that can start to mean a whole host of other things. But in general, it starts to flesh it out when we say, okay, if it's a difference, but also it could be a lot of other things. So it's not necessarily the idea of I'm isolated, I'm not talking to everyone. However, being isolated and having no physical contact, no conversation with other people can be detrimental. I'll cover that in just a second. But you can also have the aspect of feeling alone without feeling lonely, and you can also feel alone and be lonely. Um, and another kind of final important one that I think it's mixed up quite a bit, and I'm happy to clarify this, that people can feel depressed, or we can have the experience of having depression, whether we've lived with it or it's new. But loneliness comes alongside depression or feeling depressed quite often. In terms of research lingo, loneliness and depression is highly correlated, meaning generally above 50% of the time that someone feels depressed, they're probably going to be lonely as well. But there is interesting research out there back in 2007 that was done on a 5-year study showing that people that felt depressed did feel lonely, but they had different experiences based off the loneliness aspect and the depression aspect. So it's really fancy research has been shown to say depression and loneliness are different. They are distinctly unique, and you can have both, but it does not mean that you have to have, if you have one, you have the other. Another good thing to clarify is people think of loneliness and then they imagine, well, that just means I'm not talking to anyone, or I don't physically have anyone around, I don't live with anyone. So that is the objective version, being isolated or having social isolation, where we don't contact anyone, we live alone, we don't call anyone on the phone, we don't go to the doctor's office, to the grocery store, really. That's going to be the literal version of being alone, which can have serious health effects. There's one study back in 2010 that said being isolated on a consistent basis for 1 to 2 months can result in the same physical impact as smoking 15 cigarettes a day for that entire period. So it gets a scary undertone, but that's social isolation. Loneliness is simply the subjective one. You could be talking to everybody in the world and still feel lonely. So it's a subjective, it's an emotional experience, it's something that doesn't necessarily have to make sense. Someone could say, you talk to everyone, you won't shut up, you always yammer my ear off. Well, you can still talk someone's ear off and still be lonely. So that emotional subjective piece is very real. And I would say that the typical experiences, we can go in and out of loneliness. Like I still know I'm still a young one. I'm in my 30s, but I still know I get the experience when I visit my parents and I get to see them, spend time for the holidays, and I leave them, that I do feel lonely. I usually have long drives to get over it because they live in Texas, I live here, but I'll feel lonely for a short period of time, and that's expected. But the loneliness we're concerned about and trying to help you avoid is loneliness that lasts longer than 3 hours. If you feel like it won't go away and it's just persistent, it's almost, what you'd call chronic. That chronic loneliness is shown to be the most detrimental and the most hazardous to someone's health. But not getting too into the weeds about loneliness, I think the difference or the discrepancy perspective is important because it says our minds can say something different. But there's a few other viewpoints that are going to be really important to know. That some researchers have said it's a behavioral process, meaning that you may feel lonely or you get the experience and notice that you are lonely, and that causes you to feel uncomfortable and upset, or maybe sad, maybe anxious, maybe a lot of things. And so then that triggers in our head, I should do something about this, and I go talk to someone. And so that's a behavioral choice. And whenever that's done, if it worked, you say, great, I'm less lonely, and your brain and your body all start to feel better. But in some cases, it may be a failure, and then that sets off a negative chain reaction of saying, I can't fix my loneliness, I must be a lonely person, or it can inspire a lot of other uncomfortable physical experiences that can get set off again and again, where we feel like behaviorally we can't physically do something different, and then we get lonelier as time goes on. So there's the idea that we can still do something about it, but it may not necessarily work. That may be kind of real for some of you, maybe not. But one viewpoint that I also like quite a bit, because it gives a little bit more detail to it, is the idea that loneliness is a very emotional experience. It can be, we can feel it in our thoughts and we can have it in our behaviors, but it's very much about the subjective emotional experience. And then if you look at it being emotional, it has two different things to it. I can I can be really good friends with somebody, but I don't talk to them every day. I don't share my life with them. Maybe we go out and have a meal every once in a while. We're good friends. We get each other. They get my jokes, I get their jokes. But it's not like we're romantic partners. We're not in a marriage, and we're definitely not going to try to commit to that level of connection. So there are social relationships, which usually refers to friends or close connections. So I can have a good set of friends, maybe like um, people go on travel trips together, where it's maybe a group of gals or girls that go on a trip. And so they do it once a year or when they can. And that's a good social group and that's close connection. But it's different than the emotional side, which the emotional loneliness usually connects to a spouse, a romantic partner, and even potentially a child. So the emotional aspect of loneliness means a really close, tight relationship, not something that you have friends out that you've known for years, maybe even friends since you've had since childhood. They could be included, but they don't have to be. And so this two-way perspective, emotional and social, helps you start to separate what's going on and saying, well, I have a spouse and I feel loved by them, or I have a really good friend that I feel like they get every experience about me and I don't feel lonely when I'm around them. We can have an emotional connection and not deal with emotional loneliness, but maybe we don't have enough friends. And so social loneliness is our problem, because that means something different than maybe you have a ton of friends, but you don't have a spouse, or maybe unfortunately you lost a spouse and now it's hard to maintain that connection to someone else. Emotional loneliness for a really close, intimate relationship means something very different than just being friends with someone. Because I can have acquaintances, then I can have friends, but then I can have really close connections. And it's definitely not the same. I'm sure all of you are plenty smart to know that a spouse is very different than a close friend, and a close friend is very different than an acquaintance. So hopefully that's kind of connecting some of the point that I'm talking about. That's a really big perspective of loneliness. But one final thing that does come up, because there's kind of a flip side to the coin when we talk about what is loneliness. Well, you can want to be alone. You can desire to have alone time, or as some people would call it, solitude. And that is definitely nowhere close, and it's nowhere close to loneliness, and it's very much even going in the positive direction that we're enjoying it. So the one thing I like to differentiate about that, or show the difference between, is loneliness is generally painful. It's upsetting, it's uncomfortable, it's bothersome. It's just something we wouldn't say, sign me up for a lifetime of loneliness. There's, whether it's religious texts or regular reading or just general life experience, we don't like loneliness. But solitude can feel very enjoyable. And so I laid out just a few words to say, how do I know if I'm seeking solitude over being lonely? Because sometimes being lonely means we pull back from other people. Well, an easy way to say it is, hey, I want to be alone. Does that feel comfortable when I think about it? Do I feel calm inside? I don't feel anxious. I don't feel sad, but I say, I would like to spend a little time by myself because I want to catch up on reading, or I want to just have a walk and not have to talk or do anything about it. And do I feel like it's clear to me that I'm not sad, I'm not anxious, I'm not bothered? Basically, I'm very certain about wanting to be alone for a little bit. I don't want to be alone for forever. I'd love to see someone later tonight or tomorrow or maybe on the weekends. But it's very important to say, if I want to be alone, do I at least feel comfortable, calm, and clear about what's going on? Because if I don't, hey, maybe it's a catch to say, oh no, am I dealing with some loneliness? Do I have to worry about some of this? Because I think there's been a public awareness that's been growing to say that loneliness is not something you have to shrug off or just deal with, or kind of, in terms of the guy's perspective, you don't just have to man up and deal with it, or however you want to say it. So those are some of the primary viewpoints. There's always a few more ideas about loneliness that exist out there, but all of these viewpoints that I've shared about loneliness are encompassed by every type of gender, guys and girls, or anything in between, every type of race, every type of culture, every type of country, and every type of stage in life, like 18 to 29, 30 to 50, 51 to 70, and 71 and up. Everybody gets it. So all of these apply at every stage. They may just look a little different. So a couple quick things, like if someone says, hey, what did you learn from this presentation, or what do you know about loneliness? Well, here's some very basics that just help kind of give perspective. Is this normal for me? About 20% of every adult living at any point right now, in the past, and into the future has experienced or will experience loneliness, often as sometimes during a week, which you could rate is at least half, if not more, during the week. So that's 4+ days a week, all the way up to often during their life. So 20%, 1 out of every 5 adult, 18 plus, is going to feel some loneliness that's either distressing, which is related to sometimes lonely, or painful, which is generally linked up to often lonely. So that's 1 out of 5. Another thing that comes up is in terms of what people poll and different age groups, the age group ranges tend to hit and spray a little bit about the percentages, but they do have a noticeable percentage. 50% to 80% will experience loneliness at least to the point that they notice it and they say, uh-oh, I don't feel great. But breaking that up a little bit better, anyone who feels they're a part of the baby boomer era or fits into that generation, essentially you could say was born before, I believe it's 1964, maybe 1960. If you've been born around that time and earlier, then 1 out of every 2 people in that group will feel loneliness. And they don't have it figured out very well, but the youngest generation, which you could say is millennials, whether or not you like them, Gen Z, or essentially anyone born from 1984 and up to now, if they are an adult, 80% of those individuals are going to feel lonely to a noticeable manner. So regardless of who or how old you're talking about, 50 to 80%, that's more than enough to say, okay, it's pretty common. It's everywhere. And then the final thing to really know is, believe it or not, when they do research on loneliness, they often find that men are just slightly lonelier. It's not like a crazy amount or they're at the brink or anything, but just on a general trends, men are a little bit lonelier than women when compared between males and females. And that maybe that's because women are socialized better to get friends and to talk and to connect, or it's for a number of other reasons, but research typically finds men are a little bit more lonely. And then different racial groups or ethnicities, they find that Hispanic or Latinx or anyone from Central America and South America, they are often the loneliest, followed by African American or Black individuals, and then finally white adults. However, it's not to say it's any type of competition, because in all of those groups, 40% of any of those ethnicities or races are going to feel loneliness to a very noticeable level. So it can get quite serious. Okay, so just a couple quick facts, and I think I've led on for maybe a little bit too much, but it's not just to say, okay, sure, loneliness is a big deal, but loneliness has a couple big health impacts. Mental health-wise, depression, increased issues of alcoholism, and occasionally suicidal thinking or self-harm does come about when someone feels lonely, and then that results. You can also have someone being increasingly aggressive, that they have nervousness around others, and they're very impulsive in their actions. That can be caused by loneliness, or all of these can actually cause more loneliness. It's kind of like a two-way street that it links up with. There's been connections to progression of the markers of Alzheimer's disease. It is not a guarantee, but it has at least been linked in a very purposeful manner by research, saying it wasn't just by chance that loneliness added to the story. Loneliness can increase risks of having a recurrent stroke, issues of obesity, blood pressure issues, and mess with your sleep. A newer research area that they're finding, loneliness impacts your inflammation, how your body reacts to inflamed nerves and inflamed blood vessels, and even inflammation in the brain, which people are now finding out inflammation is not great for your health. What do you know? And being lonely can reduce anti-inflammatory health responses, like taking an anti-inflammatory drug or medicine. Loneliness may actually reduce how powerful or effective that is. And then there's even been a study back in 2010 that found being lonelier over the majority or large part of our life as adults means that we may lose between 1 to 3 years of life expectancy. So it's definitely no laughing matter, and it's a very serious one, but premature mortality risks do come with some loneliness. So I take I'm going to give like 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes to ask, what do you wish you had known about loneliness when you were younger? And once you think of something, you certainly don't have to, but you're welcome to engage me with the chat feature just to check and let me know what your thought is, or maybe one piece of advice, because I can certainly take this and funnel it towards people who may need it sooner. And I can also admit that when I research loneliness, I care very much about 20 and 30-year-olds and how lonely they are. They're often found to be just as lonely as someone over 65, which is kind of surprising. They're so young, they have so much ahead of them, but they're still incredibly lonely. And I want to be a part of researchers that potentially help solve or notice what's going on so we can help them. So I'll given just a little bit more time, maybe like 30 seconds to a minute, and then I'm going to get into the very purposeful information about how to address it, because the steps can be simple, but all you have to do is know what these are, and I'll give you a few ideas about them, because the main thing to know when solving loneliness is if you are involved and you do something thoughtful, good results usually follow. Okay, so, but unless there's any chiming in, I'm going to jump forward so I don't run out of time here. So I've told y'all what loneliness might be, what it impacts, who might have it, how widespread it is. But in terms of dealing with it, in a very general way, we get stymied or sidetracked. I've heard many people just say, well, don't feel like that. Just like if you're sad or you're anxious, they'll say, well, stop feeling that way. That's not helpful to you. You know, I care about you. You should do well. Just don't feel so lonely. I mean, come on, I'm right here with you. They may even badger you about it, which is kind of weird. But we're trying to grow. Society's trying to change a little bit. So that's one way. And then I've heard people say, oh, just don't notice it. Don't think about it. You know, talking about it's not going to help you. You're just looking at it more. But all of that says is they're missing the point, and they're not being specific to the type of help that is needed, because it's not like we're saying, do my taxes, solve all my problems, make me be happy every single day. If I say, you know, I'm dealing with a little bit of loneliness, or I feel a little lonely, I'm not demanding they solve my life. But there are specific things we can think about and we can want others to do. One that research has said is huge for treating it is learning good social skills. Sometimes we don't have all the ideas about how to do it. So learning new skills on how to interact and engage people to be less lonely is good. Enhancing the chances for social support. Maybe we don't have enough options, so we need to increase it, or we need to just re-engage with the people that have helped us out a bunch. So social support is a fairly obvious but important one that research supports. Increasing just the number of times you might run into somebody, that you might have a chance to talk to someone. Actually a very interesting strategy that the United Kingdom has tried is they have instituted talking benches where they have a bench that has a special label on it when someone's walking around. And if you sit on it, it is for the direct signal that if anyone comes by, it's the signal to them, hey, I would like to talk to someone. Just to talk, just to chat, just to say whatever. But they have those benches everywhere. So that's an increased opportunity for just general social contact, whether it's good or not. So more contact is great. And then the final one that research loves is the idea of addressing what's called poor cognitive patterns or schemas. And I like to just ease it up and say, I have a thinking pattern that I don't like. My brain does something repetitively and I think about stuff that isn't helpful for me. So those are the primary treatments that are out there that they recommend. A therapist can help you do that stuff, but friends, family, community centers, any place that you feel like one of these, yeah, I could get to that. I could have some more social contact at the senior center. Yeah, I could, if there's a class to learn a few skills, I could do that. All of those are useful places. So it's not just kind of like a mental health thing. This is for everywhere. But I acknowledge that, okay, it's wonderful to have these ideas, but what are people talking about? Just give me some specifics. Don't give me the runaround. Well, this is how I like to sum them up. When we're talking social skills, do I need social skills to be less lonely? If you do, these are some things that are very typical or common to the social skill market. How well do you do making eye contact when conversing with someone else? Does it feel like you just cannot do it? Okay, well then improving eye contact skills would be useful. How do you do with listening? Do you feel like you have to hear their question more than once or you can't comprehend their question very easily? Well, there's various listening techniques that are useful to this, like having a summary and response process where they say something, you try to summarize it back. You ask them if you got it right. They tell you if you did, or if you didn't get it right, they let you know what needed to be changed. And then you offer that confirmation. It's kind of a 1, 2, 3, 4 type process. So there's listening skills. And then generally a great way to curb some loneliness and engage in a good social skill is just being active and asking questions of other people. This can mean asking them how they're doing, asking them how their life is, asking them how their kids, their family, whoever is. Maybe, they like playing tennis. So you ask them, what have you been doing with tennis lately? It could be anything, but eye contact, listening and questions, or asking questions to other people is a great way to engage in good social skills and try to feel like I'm on top of my game. I'm curbing my loneliness by knowing that I'm practicing some good skills. The other side, enhancing social support, well, I don't really know what that means. It just means engaging with other people that really get you and you get them. The easiest way for me to sum that up is saying that if someone gets you, they understand when you make a joke. You don't have to make it super obvious and you don't have to try extra hard. They understand. And you understand the things they're talking about. It's almost like you get to cut in line with conversations. You don't have to work as hard. And that's where social support really lives. If you know that someone exists like that in your life, that is a fantastic spot for social support. So if you feel like you think about someone, you say, I really get what they talk about. I get their life. I get what they mean when they say stuff to me. That is a perfect place to go. That is social support by all accounts for research. Moving over to the third one, social contact, increasing these moments of contact. It really just extends to finding common experiences together, like lunch, activities, outings, walks, whatever it's going to be. And I would say my perspective for treating loneliness with social contact is maybe you can't do it with friends all the time. Maybe it has to be someone random, because I think we've all learned that you find friends in funny places. But in order for someone to be a friend, you have to actually interact with them and find out if it's going to work. Because not trying to blame anyone, but there's weirdos in life. I know I've been a weird person growing up. Like, I felt like I was a social outcast, and I probably said some outlandish things or some silly things because of all sorts of reasons. Maybe someone will notice me if I say something weird. But it doesn't mean you have to tolerate everyone. Social contact just means you're giving people a chance to do something together. And that is just the physical presence of another person. Huge deal. Huge for all the physical effects and just a mental presence. The final one, addressing poor cognitive or thinking patterns, I just call that social thinking. And when addressing it for a strategy, talk to someone that you trust, that they're allowed to call you out on stuff or allowed to challenge if you have a bad thought, and also if they're able to actually tell you if you're having good thoughts. And that obviously means that could be a lot of people. That might be a good family member, that might be a good friend, that might be the therapist you've had forever, or it might be a new therapist that you're trying out. It might even just be like, you know what, I feel like my doctor gets me. I can mention I'm having some of these thoughts, and they can let me know if it's a good one or a bad one. And that's really all the process is when engaging social thinking to address feeling lonely. It's trying to get out of the rut. It's really just about that pattern. So social skills, social support, social contact, and social thinking are your big domain for trying to address loneliness on just an everyday pattern. Some big kind of final thoughts before we roll into any of the questions you might have or some experiences that will help others is there's two ways you can look at the loneliness process. There's a personal and interpersonal effort manner, which we just talked about. And that's really summing it up as you evaluate what's going to work for you. You don't have to use all those skills. You don't have to have just random social contact if you don't want, but you just have to think about, is it going to work for me? And then you have to say, you know what, I'm going to make the decision to use one of these, or I'm going to make the decision to not be lonely by doing something about it, because only you can help yourself. You can engage with others, but no one is going to put their hands inside your brain, move things around, and help you feel the exact way you want to feel. You have to be the active participant in it. And then just start doing whatever you can to address the personal and connection or interpersonal need that you have. So that's any of those four strategies starts to work on each three of those points. But I will also mention that sometimes it's really hard to climb out of that rut. And no matter what you do, nothing is solving it. And we do not have to blame or shame that at all. Because sometimes our brains get a little crazy. They get a little off kilter. The chemicals get out of sorts. So there is a medical or medicinal effort that can be taken. The first step is always talking to a doctor or someone who can get you close to a prescription. That is the main thing for them to be your intermediary, which you may have a primary doctor or a GP. Whoever it's going to be, that is the necessary 100% first step. The second one is potentially telling them that you heard in a loneliness seminar or a way to address loneliness that there's a couple options for medication that I could take. Asking them, hey, they said something called SSRIs help with loneliness, or they can. Well, one that's pretty popular is fluoxetine, is known to help address loneliness symptoms in a lot of clinical trials, and that's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI. So those are good options that your prescriber can help you with. There's also things called neurosteroids, which address a very fancy area of the brain called the HPA. I'm not even going to try to stretch it out, but neurosteroids help kind of elicit the proper chemical responses in the brain to address symptoms and experiences of loneliness. And then, believe it or not, a third and final one that kind of blows my mind is we've heard about oxytocin, the bonding chemical, or you hear about oxytocin being between a mom and her new baby and they're bonding, or maybe it's between a couple. Well, there's actual pills called neuropeptides that people can prescribe that essentially include oxytocin, the chemical, or one that mirrors it exactly. And you can take those to help increase a feeling of connection or a sense that I'm connected and involved with others. So SSRIs, neurosteroids, and even oxytocin, or what's called a neuropeptide medication, can be useful if you feel like all your personal self-selective efforts are not addressing your loneliness. But I think there's no more secrets. That's a huge majority of the research that is out there. I'm sure I'll share my email address at the end in case you ever need to send me questions, but I would say let's get into some of the questions, and Michelle can definitely help. I'm going to stop sharing there and we'll see what happens.
So I'm going to go ahead and end the recording here so that people feel comfortable turning their cameras on and asking questions that might be a little more personal they don't want to have shared on the internet later. So
there we go.
We'll wrap that up for YouTube now.